For 5 years, my friend and I had a podcast where we reviewed movies called We Are the Watchers of Movies. Earlier this year, after the better part of a decade, we decided that we were going to end the podcast. Well, we never reviewed Gladiator, and Gladiator II came out too late for us to review it. The desire to talk about movies and how to relate them to my other favorite topic, history, is part of what I love to do. 24 years ago, the Ridley Scott directed epic Gladiator came out, starring Joaquin, Connie, Nielsen, and Russell Crowe. The movie tells a tragic story about a Roman general who, after coming home from war, finds his family executed and is promptly enslaved and sold as a gladiator. Recently, a sequel came out, over 2 decades in the making. Historical inaccuracy is rampant throughout Hollywood, and the Gladiator films are no different. Now is as good of time as any to talk about the real-life story of gladiators and the victories and the crushing failures they faced. Please note 2 things. This episode contains spoilers about Gladiator and Gladiator II, and also there is a talk about animal deaths in this episode. For those who are uncomfortable about this subject, I understand and I hope to see you in the next episode. This is the true reality and lives of gladiators, and a historical dive into both film epics, Gladiator and Gladiator II. I'm your host, Lauren Powers, and you are listening to Not Your History Class podcast. Our standard education has barely touched upon the depth, violence, and tragedy of human history. My intention with this podcast is to illuminate the parts of our history that have been in the dark for far too long. I want to take a comprehensive dive into our world and to give a different and new perspective on our past. After all, education is our strongest weapon against tyranny. Please note, this podcast contains content and information that may not be suitable for children under the age of 13. Please be advised. A lot of individuals who are fighting in gladiatorial fights weren't all slaves. Some came from criminal backgrounds, but there were also those who were caught as prisoners of war and forced to fight. When gladiator fights first started becoming popular, the early combatants were mostly enslaved individuals or criminals. But by the 1st century AD, archaeologists and anthropologists started to know that the demographics changed on grave inscriptions, and it wasn't just a criminal or a slave's duty any longer. Some aristocrats would even take the sword to fight because they were bankrupt, or it was a way for them to make money. Women had even been allowed to fight as gladiators, but that was outlawed in 200 AD by Roman Emperor Septimus Severus. Women who fought as gladiators were often not taken seriously, but could prove themselves worthy in combat. There's even a marble relief that came from around the 2nd century AD that depicted a fight between 2 women named Amazon and Achillea, who fought to an honorable draw. Although I have found sources that imply that Amazon wasn't a name, but more a group of female fighters. Men who were free wanted to join in as there was a thrill of battle, and hearing the crowd cheering them on was sometimes irresistible. You may wonder why someone would willingly go into a career with such a high mortality rate, and the reason for that is that people went into this kind of work were social outcasts. Freed slaves, they were soldiers that had been discharged, or were even retired gladiators who wanted to come back for a period of service. For those who signed on to this, they swore an oath that if they did not follow the strict rules, then they could be burned, flogged, beaten, or killed if ordered so. They weren't always just desperate men who were needing money or ex-soldiers, but patricians, knights, and sometimes even a senator might join in. Gladiator schools were set up across the Roman Empire, the most famous one being in Capua, who was known for producing well-known fighters. There were even agents that would scour the empire to try and find potential gladiators, as the turnover was very high. The conditions in the schools were similar to the kind in a prison. Gladiators were shackled in cells, but fed better food than the prisoners, such as fortifying barley. They also received the best medical attention, as these gladiators were essentially an investment. While the word gladiator is derived from the word gladius, also known as a short sword, that was used as the primary weapon in their fights. There were 4 principal classes. There was the Samnite, the Thracian, the Myrmilo, and the Rhetarius. The Samnite carried a large sword or lance and a large shield, also called a scutum. They had protective armor on their sword arm and their left leg. Samnite and gladiator for a while were interchangeable as synonyms, which suggested an Etruscan origin, as early historians had said that gladiator fights were an import from the Etruscans. These fights were often used as a eulogy for a distinguished aristocrat who had passed away. Gladiators also made sure to hold funerals for their fallen companions. They even had a sort of trade union and would make sure that any gladiator that had family, their family would be given monetary compensation. At this time in history, 3 out of 5 people were not even making it to their 20th birthday before passing away. The statistics of a gladiator passing away in a fight was 1 in 10. Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher, statesman, orator, and tragedian, had said of the slaughter of criminals fighting against hungry wild animals and gladiators that, quote, "The men have no defensive armor. They are exposed to blows at all points, and no one ever strikes in vain. There is no helmet or shield to deflect the weapon. What is the need of defensive armor or of skill? All these mean delaying death. The spectators demand that the slayer face the man who is to slay him in his turn, and they always reserve the latest conqueror for another butchering. The outcome of every fight is death, and the means are fire and sword. This sort of thing goes on while the arena is empty." End quote. In Gladiator II, there is a depiction of a gladiator riding a rhinoceros into the arena. This is also unlikely to be true. While there were men who fought against animals, there was no record of a rhino being ridden into the arena. The Thracian weapon consisted of a curved sword called a sicca, and a small or round shield called a parma that was held to deflect blows. The Myrmilo, a gladiator, was also known as the fishman, as he had a fish-shaped crest on his helmet. He also carried a short sword and a scutum, but the armor only consisted of padding. The Rhetarius was the most unfortunate class, as they only wore a padded shoulder piece and carried a weighted net and a trident. The idea was to throw the net over the opponent, and once they were ensnared, to stab them with the trident. An upside to being a Rhetarius is that they were quicker than the heavier laden classes. The gladiators were put into different combinations, such as providing a contrast between the heavier armored classes versus the quicker, less protected classes, such as a Rhetarius versus the Myrmilo. They were often pitted against each other based on size, choosing to choose 2 opponents that have similar sizes, as there were strict rules and regulations. Although gladiators that possessed the same weapons wouldn't have been pitted against one another, gladiators were often chosen by different classes fighting each other. There was a referee that would watch over the fight and would stop if someone got seriously injured. Sometimes there was even a stalemate if the battle was going on too long and the crowd was bored. In that case, both fighters may be allowed to leave the arena with honor if the crowd had an exciting show, but it was rare. There were also equites who fought on horseback, Acidarii who fought on chariots, and Dimachares who used 2 swords at once. There were other fighters in the arenas as well, such as archers and boxers, and those who fought against animals were called the bestrii. The type of animals that were used were everything from deer, ostriches, lions, crocodiles, bears, and sometimes elephants. It was typically considered the opening act of the game, and many animals could be slaughtered in a single exhibition. In the 2nd century AD, in a 100-day festival held by Emperor Trajan, 9,000 animals were killed, and then later in a 123-day festival, 11,000 animals were killed. The amount of animals was so extreme that some species couldn't be found in their native habitat anymore, either having been driven away or captured. By 523 AD, animal fights were abolished. On the other hand, while some animals were slaughtered for the sport of it, some animals were trained to fight or were pitted against each other in fights. Sometimes in a horrific form of execution, a person faced their death, such as convicted criminals and people of the Christian faith were thrown to hungry animals, such as dogs, lions, or bears as part of the entertainment. I had mentioned earlier the Samnite being an Etruscan origin, and it's important to note that the Etruscans had influenced the Romans, as the Etruscans used to organize gladiatorial games. They often associated these contests with a rite of death, so there was sort of a religious significance when it came to these fights. The first organized Roman gladiator contests were in 264 BC and were privately organized to commemorate the death of a father. There was still somewhat of a religious aspect to these fights. The fallen gladiators were killed by a blow to the head by an attendant who would wear a costume representing Hermes, the messenger god. Hermes was the god who would escort souls to the underworld, the Etruscan equivalent being Charon. There was also the presence of the emperor himself, and he would be accompanied by priests and Vestal virgins. Emperors were deified in a way, although they were not considered gods when they were alive. However, there are some Roman rulers such as Julius Caesar who was worshipped due to his military successes. His murder elevated him to the status of a god, and the Senate granted him the title of Divus, which means the deified one. Unsurprisingly, Roman gladiator games were a way for aristocrats and emperors to show off their wealth and a way to celebrate military victories. They were used to mark visits from influential officials, to celebrate birthdays, or just for general entertainment. There was a bloody fascination that the population held with these games, as they were often a matter of life or death. The Colosseum in Rome and the Flavian Amphitheater were both massive arenas that held these games. When the gladiatorial games were first set up, they were originally in the Forum in Rome, where there were temporary stands that were set up. The weight of the combined people was not always taken into account. There were several stories of these temporary seats collapsing. One story during Tiberius's reign that had given way and killed 20,000 to 50,000 spectators. Eventually, these amphitheaters were built specifically to provide space for these games, which is part of the reason that the Colosseum was built and inaugurated in 80 AD, with games that lasted for 100 days. Eventually, ramps, pulley-drawn cages that were built would allow animals to come up through trapdoors in the arena, and they would also have sand that laid on the floor of the arena to soak up spilled blood. A lot of individuals were unemployed in Rome due to slavery, so in order to entertain them, there were baths, theaters, and circuses. Gladiatorial games were only 10 to 12 days per year, often falling around the time of the Saturnalia festival. This festival was celebrating Saturn, also known under the Greek name of Kronos, father of Zeus, and known as the god of agriculture. The festival was very lively. Work and business were suspended. Slaves were given temporary freedom, and there was even morality restrictions that were lifted. This festival also coincides with the more modern Christmas and New Year. Up to 50,000 spectators could be at these games. They would watch not only men fighting each other, but wild and exotic animals being hunted through the amphitheater. Prisoners were also executed and religious martyrs thrown to the lions. There is a misconception that the gladiators used to salute the emperor and say, "Hail, Emperor, we who are about to die salute you," when in reality, those were prisoners who said that before they were killed in mock naval battles called naumachia. This is where the huge artificial lakes were created and purposefully built arenas were made to fight these mock battles. Those who did not want to fight were often forced to by their manager, known as a lanista, and the manager's team of slaves would brandish leather whips or use red-hot metal bars to encourage them to fight. Many fought until the end, hearing the roars of tens of thousands of spectators in their ears. Some even refused to fight. In 401 AD, Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, a Roman statesman and brilliant orator, organized a fight in which Germanic prisoners were set to fight, but instead they decided to strangle each other in their cells rather than to fight and provide a spectacle. The gladiators were given a hearty feast before they were going to fight, and the next day they were paraded around the arena and then presented themselves to the emperor. The opening events may have farcical fights with wooden swords. The weapons used by the gladiators were sharp and lethal. War trumpet would sound after lots were drawn, and the trumpet would sound indicating the start of the games. There were flutes, horns, and a water organ that would play in the background as gladiators fought. Emperors were given the right to choose the fate of the loser, and if they were not in attendance, then a chosen producer of the games would decide. The gladiator who lost, or was about to lose, if they were not killed outright, would often beg for mercy by dropping his weapon and shield and raising one finger. His opponent could either choose mercy or kill them. It may have been better for the opponent long term to kill their adversary, as it is possible they could meet them again in battle. If the emperor was present, then he would make the decision about what would happen to the losing opponent. The crowd tried to influence the emperor by gesturing, waving cloths, and yelling to either let him go or execute him. Thumbs up for life, thumbs down for death. And this isn't totally proven to be true, however, that a thumbs down definitely meant death. There is a theory that a thumbs up meant death, and a closed fist with two fingers extended or a waved handkerchief could have meant mercy for the defeated. Gladiators became celebrities in their own right. Even some with aristocratic ladies who would have affairs with these men, or in some cases even elope with them. Graffiti in Pompeii was indicative of how the public felt about gladiators, especially with women. Some even had written next to them how many victories they had, such as Petronius Octavius, who had 35, Severus, who had 55, and Nasia, who had 60. These averages were usually much lower, and the men who had these high rates were rare. The triumphant gladiators were so popular that it wasn't unheard of for women to wear hairpins or jewelry that had been dipped in the gladiators' blood, which was considered a remedy against impotence. Some of them even mixed gladiator sweat, which was considered an aphrodisiac, into cosmetics. A bride who had her hair parted by the spear of a gladiator that had been defeated would be said to have a fertile married life. They were given material rewards for winning these battles, such as a crown or a silver dish with prize money on it, or a palm branch of victory, which was very prestigious. Some may even been able to win their freedom after years of fighting. Regardless of their winning status, gladiators were considered to be outcasts of society and weren't treated better than criminals or those who have professions who could be considered shameful. Tertullian, a Christian theologian and moralist, commented on the pleasure that people find in the shedding of blood. Quote, "Next taunts or mutual abuse without any warrant of hate and applause, unsupported by affection, the perversity of it. They love whom they lower, they despise whom they approve. The art they glorify, the artist they disgrace." End quote. Spartacus was probably the most famous of gladiators. Certainly in the 20th century, he had made a comeback with several films and television shows about him. Spartacus was originally from Thrace, who had been formerly a Roman soldier. He became a bandit but was captured and forced to train as a gladiator. In 73 BC, he and 70 companions escaped training school and set up a camp on Mount Vesuvius. They had to flee, and as they went through the countryside of Campania, they collected more followers and trained them into an efficient fighting force. Spartacus defeated 4 Roman armies on 9 different occasions. Like any person, though, Spartacus was no saint, and when a friend of his died in battle, he arranged for 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death in gladiator contests. Spartacus and his army revolted for 2 years until they were defeated by the army of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who quashed the rebellion in Apulia in the south of Italy. 6,000 prisoners were crucified on the Appian Way between Rome and Capua. Due to this rebellion, there was a strict control over how many gladiators a private citizen could own. Another famous gladiator was Emperor Commodus, who had been rumored to have been the son of a gladiator. He had gotten an amazing salary for his appearances, but due to his status as emperor, it was pretty unlikely that he was in danger. He was usually dressed as Mercury, also known as Hermes, who was mentioned earlier. Hermes is the god of shopkeepers, merchants, thieves, and tricksters. Commodus mostly participated in the slaughter of animals such as bears and panthers, where he would stand on a protected platform with a bow and arrow. He would boast about his victory in 1,000 matches, and these opponents would sometimes get their noses and ears cut off by the emperor. Although Commodus wasn't the only emperor who liked to perform in the arena, there was also Caligula, Titus, and Hadrian, but they were not in the fray the way a regular gladiator was. Instead, they were in controlled conditions, and their opponents fought with dull blades. As time went on, it became very obvious that these shows of bloody death were less about the grieving loss of a loved one and more a lavish and frankly disgusting display of wealth for emperors. Tertullian, a Christian theologian and moralist, had said, quote, "This class of public entertainment has passed from being a compliment to the dead to being a compliment to the living," end quote. In 404 AD, gladiator fights finally came to the end with Emperor Honorius and a more Christian-minded empire. Honorius had shut down the schools about 5 years earlier, and the final catalyst for the change was when a monk from Asia Minor tried to stop 2 gladiators from fighting, and the monk ended up getting stoned to death by the crowd. Due to this, the contests were banned, although there were still criminals who were being forced to fight against wild animals, and that practice continued on for another century. After this information dump, you may find yourself wondering, are the gladiator films accurate as far as gladiator lives go? And the truth is, sort of. Like any historical film, there are certainly things that have been dramatized for effect. Gladiator clothing was not period accurate and seemed to have been taken inspiration from later time periods. As expressed earlier, gladiator fights were not often to the death. Remember that it was expensive to keep a gladiator alive, so death was not a desired outcome for these gladiatorial displays. As for the thumbs up, thumbs down equals life or death, that is also not accurate, and there is still discourse on what that actually might have meant during the time. A thumbs up could have meant death, and a thumbs down could have meant life. What was also not shown was like sports stars of today. Gladiators were often used in advertising and to market products to consumers. In the 2000 film, we see Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, fighting against Emperor Commodus, played by Joaquin Phoenix. I had mentioned Commodus before, who had liked to participate in gladiatorial games, but he was killing animals, not fighting against other men. Maximus was also a fictional character, likely inspired by real people, but Commodus was not fictional. Commodus was definitely a controversial figure during his time. He may have been mentally unstable, as he was in the movie, and he did rule the Roman Empire for 12 years. He would frequently do things like change the months and the legions after himself. He had 12 different names that he went by. He supposedly held naked gladiator contests, which could have outraged citizens and led him to being an unpopular figure, a bad reputation, and later his downfall. Horrifically, he also killed people with disabilities in the arena, which was highly frowned upon by society and likely led to his murder. Overall, historians that were hired to advise the movie either quit or didn't want the credit because the 2000 film was so historically inaccurate. I wanted to wait to be able to see the second Gladiator film before releasing this episode, and as it appeared in the first one, Ridley Scott likes to take some liberties with history and create his own narrative. Please note that there will be spoilers for this film. In the film, we get to see a naval battle being fought, and while I had mentioned this earlier in the episode that was certainly something that happened, it was unlikely that it was occurring in the Colosseum. Any naval battles would have had their own separate arena to perform. Ridley Scott also added sharks into the water, and that is definitely not a thing that would have occurred. The arenas were usually shallow basins that were fed into by a river using a specially built aqueduct that would come from a nearby river like the Tiber. These basins were called naumachia, and while some experts have been able to figure out how it would be possible to have some sort of water events in the Colosseum, there would be many limitations, such as how would they be able to make the structure watertight? Or would water be even able to be held up by the floor when there is a lot of structure to the Colosseum beneath the floor? Or how would the water be able to get into the building, and how would they drain it out? How would they be able to get naval ships into the arena? Historian Suetonius claimed that Emperor Domitian had staged a naval battle in the Colosseum in 85 AD, but that would have been before the structures beneath it were built. The second movie takes place 16 years after the original, and this is after Commodus, the emperor, had died and now was replaced by two emperors, Caracalla and Geta. In real life, Lucilla, the daughter of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus' sister, portrayed by Connie Nielsen, had passed away before her brother Commodus had died, although she was portrayed as being still alive in the film. Her husband, Acacius, played by Pedro Pascal, was a fictional creation as well, likely an amalgamation of several different real-life historical figures, which meant that his rebellion against Emperors Geta and Caracalla was not a thing that occurred. However, Macrinus, played by Denzel Washington, was a real-life person at one point in history. Conceivably, there is about 1 year that this could have taken place, and that is 211 AD. Because this is when both the rulers Caracalla and Geta were ruling together and only did so for a few months. The boys were named emperors by their father, Septimus Severus, who on his deathbed named them as his successors, but neither of these boys could get along. Professor Alison Futrell, historian of ancient Rome and the gladiatorial games, had said that the two emperors, quote, "From reading the ancient sources, we have the impression that as teenagers, Caracalla and Geta were kind of off the wall in their behavior, running amok and indulging their pleasures and passions in adolescent kinds of ways. There's a lot of tension between the two and moments where their father had to step in and calm things down." End quote. So after Severus had passed away, the two boys were fighting, and it went from bad to worse. At one point in time, they actually wanted to split the Roman Empire along the Bosporus, a strait in Turkey. An egregious decision that was made as far as Caracalla and Geta goes was that their characters were completely whitewashed, portrayed by Fred Hetchinger and Joseph Quinn, respectively. Their real-life father, Emperor Septimus Severus, was from North Africa, and their mother, Julia Domna, was from Syria. In Rome at this time, there were a lot of people of color that had hailed from Africa and held positions of power. Alison Futrell said, quote, "The mixed race aspect of Caracalla is something that's commented about in some of our sources. Now, our sources don't like Caracalla, so they say he shows the worst aspects of each of these people that he springs from. We were kind of disappointed. This is an opportunity to show diversity within the imperial power, and the filmmakers don't seem to have chosen that pathway." End quote. Geta's death was a historically accurate description, although how it came about may have not been completely accurate. In the film, Emperor Caracalla is convinced by Denzel Washington's character, Macrinus, to murder his brother, and Macrinus even literally guides the teenager's hand to slit his brother's throat. In the film, he is portrayed as being whiny, obnoxious, with what seems like a sadistic desire to watch pain being inflicted, as several times it seems though he is deriving pleasure from watching gladiators fight. Historically, Caracalla was actually the older brother, not the younger one as he is portrayed in the film, and historically, he was seen as being domineering and very capable. When he had ordered his brother murdered in December of 211 AD, he had forced his brother to be killed in front of their mother, Julia Domna, who was not in the film. Historian Alison Futrell said, quote, Gaeta is clinging to her skirts, screaming for help and calling upon the woman who bore him. She is unable to fend off her older son and is wounded in the effort of trying to do so. In the wake of that, she's forced to pretend to be happy. She's not able to grieve for her younger son because of the overwhelming authority of Caracalla. End quote. It is not known why Caracalla wanted his brother dead. That motivation is unfortunately lost to history. I would imagine it's probably a strong desire for power that he would have not been able to have with his brother co-running the empire with him. Caracalla went on to rule for 6 years, and he was obsessed with the idea of becoming the next Alexander the Great. He wanted to mimic him in every way. Macrinus was portrayed as a former gladiator and owned by Marcus Aurelius. That is fiction. While he had humble beginnings and later became the Praetorian Prefect, which is a distinguished rule among the Praetorian Guard who served as bodyguards to the emperor, Futrell said that, quote, Macrinus supposedly doesn't have much of an education in terms of law and policy in Roman tradition. Some of our sources do think of him as someone who is trying his best, someone who is not being presented as utterly evil or unprincipled or immoral through and through, as others near the center of power are. End quote. Later in life, Macrinus started to conspire to get rid of Caracalla, who did not die by Macrinus' hand, but rather by a disgruntled soldier while they were on campaign. And after that, Macrinus becomes the emperor of Rome. Futrell said that Macrinus may have been working off an idea or even a prophecy that he was meant to hold imperial power. Quote, he is aware of that, and the idea that destiny has outlined for him by divine forces of the universe may present him with a different kind of motivation. End quote. Macrinus did not end up dying in the movie like fashion at the hands of Lucius, portrayed by Paul Mescal, but instead he had fallen at the hands of a conspiracy that was created by female relatives of Gaeta and Caracalla, as he was emperor for less than a year and he never even set foot inside of Rome. The original threat of conspiracy came from Caracalla and Gaeta's mother, Julie Domna, who was arrested by Macrinus. While she was in his prison, she starved herself to death. Her sister Julia Mesa took over the mantle, and she started to spread a rumor that her grandson, Elagabalus, who was 14 years old at the time, was Caracalla's illegitimate child. Caracalla had been liked by many people in the army, whereas Macrinus was not popular. The soldiers were quick to proclaim that Elagabalus was emperor, although history may know him better as Heliogabalus, and he may have been the first transgender emperor. Macrinus fled in 218 AD after he and his army were defeated at the Battle of Antioch by those who backed Elagabalus. Macrinus and his son were caught and both were executed not too long after. After his execution, Elagabalus issued something called a damnatio memoriae on Macrinus and had his name wiped from public records. While there was a Lucius that was Lucilla's son, he was not the one portrayed in the film by Paul Mescal. Lucilla was the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, who passed away in the first film in 2000, and her brother was Commodus, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix in the first film. She had married twice, one to Lucius Verus, who was the adopted son and co-emperor of her father. They had 3 kids, 2 daughters, and a son named Lucius Verus. Lucius Verus died in childhood in 169 AD and may have been meant to inherit the throne, but died too young in order to be able to do so. His father, Lucilla's first husband, also passed away the same year. She was then married to Tiberius Claudius Pomponius in the same year, and they had a child named Lucius Aurelius Commodus Pomponius. This Lucius did survive to the year that Gladiator II was set into 11 AD, but little was known about his life, and he may have been executed by Caracalla, but the facts are unclear. Please subscribe to my podcast, and if you are listening on iTunes, please give the podcast 5 stars. It really helps me get out there. I am currently on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, so follow me on social media as well. If you are looking for sources for this episode, please check out our show notes. Transcripts and sources will be on my website, notyourhistoryclass.com. Researching, hosting, production, and editing is done by Lauren Powers. Theme song is done by Mike Meyers, and you can find him at the Mike Show 42 on X. If you have any recommendations or suggestions for a future episode, you can direct message me via social media or email me at notyourhistoryclass@gmail.com.